Mr. Melson, I understand we're in the 21st century, and I guess at this point everybody has a cell phone. Would that be fair to say? Very many people have cell phones.
I believe the statistics are 98%, 93%, something like that. Yes, sir.
And most people will keep their phones with them at almost all times.
I think that's a reasonable assumption. Yes, sir.
Now, it's your testimony that the location that you provided is location information for the tower and for the sector used by the phone, correct?
Yes, I'm testifying as to the location of the antenna that was used and which direction it faces.
Okay, so you're not giving the jury the location of the phone itself.
That's correct.
So in all of those graphics that we saw, some 70 pages of graphics, at no time can you tell the jury the location of any particular phone,
That's correct.
including Miss Elvis's phone.
That's correct. What we can tell is a general location, not a specific location.
Can you tell us where a phone is located within a sector?
No, sir.
So you're providing general location information only.
Yes, sir.
And by sector, we're talking about those pie-shaped wedges that you had on the graphs?
Well, I don't even get into, the boundaries of the sector. That simply shows where the antenna is and which way it faces. We know that the phone was picked because that antenna had the best signal. And we know by design that that antenna is going to project its best signal out in front and somewhere overlapping its neighbors.
So when we saw that pie-shaped graph and it had a green section that's supposed to be the sector that Sidney Moore's phone was using, you couldn't tell us exactly where that phone is within that sector.
Well, we can't even tell the exact shape of the sector. Again, that graphic symbol only shows us the antenna location and direction. We know the phone used it because it had the best signal, which is going to be in the general area out in front.
And like you said, you can't tell the shape of the sector either, correct?
That's correct.
So on the graph, they all look like they're nice pie shapes. But in reality, a sector is based on signal strength. Is that correct?
I guess you could say it that way. Signal quality is a better ratio. They all are projecting their signals. If you think of these antennas as projecting sound instead of invisible waves, and they're playing music, you can imagine that as you move around, you'll hear sound from two speakers, but as you move away from one and toward the other, one will get less and one will get more. You're always going to pick the speaker with the best signal. We're not necessarily drawing hard lines that say it has to stop here and start here. That sound travels, they overlap. So the phone picks the one with the best signal, which generally is going to be one in that location, that area.
So according to the strength of the antenna signal, that would dictate the area or circumference, the arc of the sector.
When we get into trying to predict or determining the coverage area, signal strength or actually power wattage of the transmitter is one factor, but it's one of many. Terrain is another, obstruction, so it involves a lot of things.
Could you tell us an address where a phone is located at any particular moment?
From these records?
Yes.
No, sir.
No. The records that you have testified to, are those GPS records?
No, sir.
No. Those are phone location records, correct?
They're called detail records that include the location of the antenna used.
Okay. Are those records as accurate as GPS records?
No, sir. Well, as I assume you mean with respect to the location of the phone.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay. So what you presented to the jury is the second most accurate information?
I presented the jury an accurate map reflecting the locations of the antennas used and an explanation of why that antenna was used.
But you've also testified that GPS is more accurate.
In determining a location of, say, a phone that has GPS along with the phone, yeah, if we had a GPS next to the phone, we could tell more accurately where the phone was.
So if I were driving around town and my phone was navigating me, would my phone navigate me around town using GPS, or would it use the data that you provided?
Well, certainly the phones we have now are different than the ones that were probably used 6 years ago in this case. If you're navigating, you're using the GPS in your smartphone now.
Did you do any testing to determine the coverage areas of the towers that were analyzed in this case?
No, sir, I did not.
So a cell phone will typically use the tower with the best signal, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And generally that means the tower that's closest to the phone.
Often we will find that to be true. Where that varies, if we have obstructions such as high-rise towers along the oceanfront down here, terrain, those type of things will affect it most of all. But if it's a flat area, no obstructions, generally it's not uncommon to see the closest, but the phone has no idea where the towers are. It just picks the best signal, simple as that.
Buildings would affect the location, the signal, correct?
They can, sir, yes.
Okay, and you know, signage or postage outside might affect the signal too.
Yes, sir.
When you're requested to do an analysis, you're provided records from the state, is that correct?
I do analysis for a lot of different organizations. I've looked at records for prosecutors, for defense teams, for insurance companies. So whoever wants me to do the analysis usually provides the records.
Okay. And in this case, the state provided you the records that you used?
Yes, sir.
And they provided you records from Sprint and records from T-Mobile?
Yes, sir.
Do they also provide you details such as dates, times, and locations?
Eventually, yes. My approach to this, I tend to prefer getting the records without much case background. I'll do my initial analysis of the records to see what they say without trying to be influenced or biased by anything. Then I'll start asking for additional information such as facts of the case to see if my analysis is consistent or contradicts the facts as they're presented. So eventually, yes, I do get that information, but I try and do that after my initial analysis.
Okay, and in this case, the state also gave you address information.
Probably.
They gave you...
Certainly the push pins on the map.
Right, the
Yes,
Moore
sir.
residence,
Yes, sir.
Peachtree Boat Landing.
Yes, sir, that's
and
common.
the Elvis residence.
Common in any analysis I do. Locations of interest would be provided at some point. Yes, sir.
And you had those, like you said, the push buttons on that presentation,
Yes,
push
sir.
pins. The state also provided you with a time frame to look at.
They had areas that they certainly wanted to spend a little more time on, but as you saw, I did display the entire set of records, even going back to March 1st. The challenge is to digest all of that and present it quickly so that we're not here for days looking at meaningless data.
Did you conduct any testing of the signal strength of the towers that were used in your report?
No, sir, I did not.
Okay. So you can't tell us the coverage area for any particular tower that you have listed in your report?
Not to that level. What we can deduce from these records is the general area. If you think of these antennas similar to, say, sprinklers in a front lawn, it's reasonable that they're going to lightly overlap with their neighbors. We don't have towers that are designed to cover the entirety of Myrtle Beach and then the next one the entirety of Myrtle Beach. So no, I didn't do any type of testing, drive testing they call it, to determine it. But the general area that these phones are in is something that we can determine from just these records.
Okay, so far you have told us that the state provided you with the second best data available, that is location information as opposed to GPS information, correct?
Yes, they provide me the phone records and those addresses. Yes, sir.
And you have also testified that you did not check the signal strength of the towers that you put in your report. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Let let me hand you what's been marked as State's Exhibit number 63 and ask you if you recognize this document.
Yes, sir. It's slide 5 from my presentation.
So that is, this notebook is a copy of the presentation that you gave on the
Yes.
PowerPoint. Now, on page 5 of that presentation, you have cell ID information,
Yes, sir.
correct? Now, regarding the cell location graphics, I think you indicated that these graphics indicate only the antenna location and direction. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So that goes back to the signal strength. You can't tell us anything about it.
Correct.
All right. And you also indicated that this data does not represent any type of antenna radio frequency coverage area.
Right. These maps do not estimate a coverage area for these antennas.
Okay, does Sprint estimate coverage areas?
They do estimate propagation maps as part of their planning.
Okay, and same with T-Mobile.
I'm sure they do as well.
But the location information provided in this case was does not represent the type of antenna radio frequency coverage area.
That's correct.
Now, let me ask you about PCMD. What is PCMD?
PCMD stands for per call measurement data, and it's exactly that. It's data that's measured for each call. The original intent of that was for the engineers to help tune the network. It would help them determine where dead spots were so that they could improve coverage and eliminate those dropped calls.
Do all wireless companies collect PCMD?
I don't know about all companies. We have those records, that type of data from Sprint in this case.
Okay, so some companies collect this data and some companies do not.
Again, I can't speak to all the companies out there. I know we have it for Sprint here.
Okay, so Sprint collected the data in this case, and you used that data in the PowerPoint presentation, correct?
Yes, sir.
And what was the purpose of that data being collected?
It's used, again, to help determine and improve the network. That was its original intent. Whether they use it for other things beyond that, I don't know.
Help determine and improve the network. Said another way, is that a nice way of saying this data is for internal use only?
Well, I suspect that if they felt that way, it wouldn't have been disclosed in the search warrant. They certainly hold those propagation maps that you referred to and don't release those under warrant because they do conclude that those are internal only.
But in this case, they released that PCMD information, correct?
Yes, sir.
Did they also give you a disclaimer with that information?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so there is a written disclaimer from Sprint that comes along with the PCMD data that says that this data should not be used for location. Is that correct?
I don't have the exact disclaimer. I'd be happy to read it if you do have it. I am aware of the disclaimer. I just want to make sure we get it right, sir.
So you've indicated that you are aware of the disclaimer?
Yes.
Let me hand you what's been marked for identification purposes only as Defense Exhibit number 3 and ask you if you recognize what that is.
Yes, this is the document Sprint produces regarding that data.
So that is the actual disclaimer
Yes.
for the data that you just presented to this jury.
Yes.
Now, that data that you received, did you receive it from the solicitor's office or did you receive it directly from Sprint?
I believe, well, from the solicitor's office, it may have come from law enforcement as opposed to the solicitor's office, but it was not from Sprint.
Okay. Do you know if you received that data by way of preservation letter or by way of search warrant?
I do not.
Do you know if different types of data would be received depending on whether or not the solicitor's office or the police department issued a preservation letter versus a search warrant?
I do not. In general, it is normally the same. The only difference is some of this data is perishable. Search warrants take a while, so the preservation letter is actually not to produce records, but to keep them from being deleted while a search warrant can be obtained.
Does Sprint always issue a disclaimer with the per call measurement data?
It's common to get this disclaimer, yes, sir.
Do other wireless network providers also issue a disclaimer when it comes to per call measurement data?
Yes, this is a common type disclaimer.
And why would Sprint issue a disclaimer for this particular information?
I can't speak as to Sprint's motivations. This is typically the type of legalese that we would see at the bottom of these reports.
Well, tell the jury how per call measurement data works.
May I read the disclaimer here just
Yes,
for the record? Sprint will not guarantee the accuracy
Your
of...
Honor, at this time, if he's going to read from it, if Mr. Galmore putting it in evidence,
It has not, so we object to publishing it. Your objection is sustained and wants to admit it.
Very well, sir.
You want to admit it?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Any objection to submission?
no objection.
All right, now you can publish.
Okay, well, this is now defense exhibit number
3.
3. All right, please read the disclaimer to the jury.
Thank you. Sprint will not guarantee the accuracy of the location information. Now, I'll point out they don't say that it's inaccurate, they don't guarantee it.
Okay, let me see that again, please. And what you read was from the bottom of page 1 of a 2-page exhibit.
Yes, sir.
So even though they sent you the data and they sent you a disclaimer, that data was still incorporated into your PowerPoint presentation.
It was incorporated based on my years of experience. I've used this same data to locate numerous missing persons. In fact, of the close to 20 missing persons that I've been involved in helping recover, the vast majority of them were found using these distances. So although Sprint's attorneys probably wrote this disclaimer, my personal experience in the field and the families of those people who were missing would show that that accuracy can be quite good.
Thank you for that. But the bottom line is Sprint gave you the information with a disclaimer.
Yes.
Can PCMD data show the actual location of a cell phone?
No, sir, it does not.
Okay. So any of your presentation that it never purports to tell the location of a cell phone?
Correct, and I did try and make that clear during my
Okay.
presentation.
And we're making it clear
Yes.
now. And even with the additional data, the PCMD data, you still cannot give the location of a cell phone.
No, I think it helps us take the general area down toward around that distance, but to the gentleman's point, we still do not have an actual guaranteed GPS location of the phone.
Okay. All right, let me go back to sectors for a minute.
Yes, sir.
If you have 2 addresses that are within a tower, you can't tell us with any degree of certainty whether or not the phone was located at one address or the other, can you?
No, sir.
All you can really tell us is where the tower itself is located.
And we can make some pretty reasonable determinations of the general area that antenna would provide best signal. Yes, sir.
And even if you know the exact coverage area of a tower, you still cannot tell us where a phone is located within that coverage area.
That's correct, sir.
So you analyzed the call detail records for Tammy Moore's phone, Heather Elvis' phone, and Sidney Moore's phone, correct?
Yes, sir.
And based on your analysis of those call detail records, can you tell us if 2 or more of the phones were together at any point in time?
What we can tell from the records is, as we showed in the
Sir,
maps.
can you answer my question and then you can give an explanation?
He's entitled to answer the question.
Thank you, Your Honor.
He's in the process of it.
Yes, sir.
Go.
Would you mind repeating the question, sir?
All right. Based on your analysis of call detail records, can you tell us if 2 or more phones were together at any point in time?
We can talk to the general area. We can see that they've moved the same distances at the same times. We can see that they're using the exact same towers at similar times. That does not necessarily put them in the exact same vehicle, for instance, but over time, as we see them consistently using different towers around town, we have to assume that they had to have traveled to get there.
So the answer is no, you cannot tell us if 2 phones were together at any point in time.
Not to the degree of certainty that I think you're trying to get to here, sir, no.
So based on your analysis of these phone records, can you tell us if Sidney's phone was with Heather Elvis's phone at any time?
No, sir. Just in the same general area at the same time. That
What
does
time
not,
frame-
that does not preclude them being together. It just doesn't prove them together.
What time frame do the call detail records cover?
But we started in beginning of March all the way through the end of December.
Right. And can you give us the date that Heather Elvis went missing?
I believe she was reported missing December 18th.
Okay. So the call detail records cover the 17th and the 18th?
Yes, sir.
Correct. Okay. I'm going to ask you to look at pages 8 through 12 of your report, sir.
Yes, sir.
And those pages represent the calls between Tammy and Heather and Sidney telephones. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And the arrows represent who made the call, and they point to the call, who the call was made to.
Yes, sir. Voice or text.
Right. Now, you've got boxes on this exhibit also, right above here. And they say voice, text, data, other, correct?
Yes. Those are filters in our software. They're all checked in here, which means we didn't remove any of the evidence that might have been there. In our analysis, we can uncheck the text box so that we would only see the voice calls. Yeah. If there were data, unchecking data would take those out, although those aren't relevant here. So those are filters in the software. They're all checked here, which means that we applied the analysis to all the data we had available.
Okay, so you have a box checked for a data call, but there's no such thing as a data call.
No, in this particular, we're just simply showing that we didn't filter out any records.
Are there any other forms of communication in between those numbers, other than the calls and the text in the call detail records?
Yes, folks can use apps that would not be known to the phone company.
Right, okay. You also have a box that says other. What does that box represent?
Means if our software determined that a record was not easily identified as voice, text, or data, that we would simply flag it as other.
And you have these boxes checked on your presentation, correct?
Simply to indicate that we did not filter out any of the available records of any type.
But they don't really mean anything because there's no such thing as a data call, correct?
This is a general user interface used throughout all records. So perhaps I could design the software a little better.
And that's the key. Those boxes are checked because your software decided to check those boxes.
Well, I, as the user of the software, decided to leave them checked during this analysis because I didn't want to leave any records that may be in the raw data out of my analysis. It's just that.
Do you have a box on there that's checked for routed?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and what does routed mean?
Those are calls that are internal to the network, such as routing to voicemail. It's not uncommon for me to go ahead and use those in the analysis of common calls because they do contain some useful phone numbers at times.
Are routed calls completed calls?
Routed calls are often associated with other records to document an entire usage event, so they can be associated with completed calls. Completed can also include going to voicemail.
So when a call is routed, that means it rang to voicemail or forwarded to voicemail or somebody didn't pick up. Is that
That's
right?
one use case. There are others within the network. It simply means the network is needing to link together different resources to complete the call. And so the internal phone line that was used perhaps to route a call from the Columbia switch to the Dallas switch would be a routing call.
So if it's a routed call, that means the person on the other end didn't pick up.
Not necessarily, no, sir.
So is a routed call a completed call or not?
It's a leg of a usage.
Well, the information that we have been provided in State's Exhibit number 5 contains several routed calls at the bottom of this graph. Is that correct?
I don't see the indication here. What I see is that these in a direction are all indicated as outgoing, so I don't see the word routed here.
Okay, so the word routed is not on this graph.
No, these are Heather's records, the T-Mobile records.
So in order for us to find out if the call was routed or not, we need Mr. Moore's Sprint records.
Sprint does include routed calls in their records.
But these calls lasted approximately 0.03 seconds.
In the Sprint, or in the T-Mobile records, they're documented in minutes, so 0.03 minutes. The timing of duration can sometimes be a little confusing in these records. There's the setup time, which they call seizure time. There's the billable time. And so not all of the durations will always necessarily match directly because they record different amounts of these total completion events of calls.
The bottom line is that we don't know if these calls were completed, the 0.03 second calls.
In which regard, sir?
We don't know if these calls were received by Mr. Moore's phone.
From Heather's records, we don't document that the calls were received by Mr. Moore's phone. In Heather's records, we simply see that the calls did in fact leave Heather's phone, connect to the network, and then presumably leave the Sprint or the T-Mobile network.
Okay, so the call was made, the call got on the network, it left the Sprint network, but you can't tell us if the call ended up with Mr. Moore's telephone.
Not from the T-Mobile net records, no.
So we have no way of knowing if these calls were completed.
We see the corresponding records for these same 4 calls in Mr. Moore's records as well. So we do know that they made it over to the Sprint network because we have 4 corresponding records in Mr. Moore's phone records as we see in Ms. Elvis records.
Okay. Were there any incoming calls or text from Ms. Elvis' phone to Mr. Moore's phone on December 17th or 18th?
Yes, on the 18th.
Okay. Were there any outgoing calls from Sidney's phone to Heather Elvis' phone on December 17th or 18th?
I would certainly want to review the records, make sure, but I don't recall any, no, sir.
So, subject to your review of the records, you do not recall seeing Mr. Moore's phone reach out and make contact with Ms. Elvis' phone?
To make sure I'm understanding your question, as an outbound call from Mr. Moore's phone to Heather's phone?
Yes.
No, sir, I don't recall seeing those in the records.
Okay. So based on that testimony, we can say that Mr. Moore's phone never called or texted Ms. Elvis' phone on July 17th or July 18th.
I can't say that. What I can say is that I don't see it in the records. It is possible that And I have seen where not all the text messages that are placed make it into the records. So I can't say with 100% certainty whether that's true or not. What I can say with 100% certainty, and looking at my report here, there are no documented voice or text calls through the Sprint network or as received by the T-Mobile network from Mr. Moore's phone to Heather's phone.
You asked July 17th, July.
I'm sorry.
I want to be sure so the record's clear. I don't know whether you heard that, but I heard July 17th, July 18th. I assume it was December.
Yes, sir.
Okay, excuse me.
I answered for December.
Yes, sir.
Thought you did, but
Yes, sir.
the record be consistent. Thank you.
Can you tell the jury what tower and sector Sidney Moore used the most according to his call detail records?
Yes.
And what tower was that?
I don't have those facts memorized, but I do believe, and it's common, that it was the tower north of his residence and facing his residence.
Would it be Tower 115?
Yes, sir, I believe it is.
Can you tell us how many times Mr. Moore's phone used Tower 115 in the records that you have? I think your records are from March of 2013 to December of 2013.
I could, sir. I don't have that number in front of me right now.
Okay. If I said that it was over 1,000 times, would you disagree with that?
That would seem reasonable.
Can you tell us which sector of Tower 115 faces the Moore residence?
I believe it's sector 2. Whichever sector it is, it faces due south 180 degrees.
Okay. I think it was sector 2.
Yes, sir.
Could you tell us how many calls were made off of sector 2 by Sidney Moore's phone?
I can't. I don't have that data in front of me right now.
Can you tell us what tower and sector was used by Sidney Moore's phone from 3:16 a.m. to 3:41 a.m. on December 18th?
It was that same sector, the one facing south.
Okay, and I think you said that was sector 2,
Yes, sir.
and that's the sector that's facing Sidney Moore's home.
Yes.
And this would be the tower that covers Sidney Moore's home.
It does appear so, yes, sir.
Okay, so from 3:14 to 3:41, seems the only records that we have for Mr. Moore are from the location of his residence.
Yes, sir.
And that is the same tower that he usually uses, Tower 115.
It's his most common. I would expect that it provides service at his home. We would call that typically the home tower, and it was that same tower that evening, yes, sir.
Can you tell us how far Tower 115 is from the Moore residence?
I could. I don't have that in front of me, but it certainly could be measured on a map.
Okay, could you tell us how far Tower 115 is from Peachtree Landing?
No, sir. It's certainly further away from that, but I can't tell you how far it is.
Is there a Sprint tower that is closer to Peachtree Landing than Tower 115?
I would suspect so, but again, I don't have that information handy in front of me to make sure.
You didn't receive that information in subpoena?
I do. I just haven't memorized the location of every tower in the area.
Okay, could you check and tell us if Tower 80 is the Sprint tower that is closer to Peachtree Landing than Tower 115?
I don't have the records in front of me. It would take me some time to do that, but that's certainly reasonable, sir. I would expect there to be other towers closer to Peachtree Landing.
Okay. Does Sidney Moore's phone ever use Tower 80 on December 17th or December 18th?
Do you have a location, sir? It's hard for me to say. I want to make sure I'm accurate here.
I'm sorry, you can get whatever records you need to get, sir.
Well, we're talking about a tower that I'm not certain, based on not having memorized Sprint's entire network from 2013 in the area. So if it's necessary, I'm more than happy to go through all the records and see that. But I can't say it off the cuff, sir, and I want to make sure I'm accurate.
Okay, so, but you testified regarding Miss Elvis's records.
I've testified to all three of them, yes, sir.
And you testified that Miss Elvis was on Sprint.
Ms. Elvis is on T-Mobile's network.
I'm sorry, T-Mobile?
Yes, sir.
Okay. You can't tell us if Mr. Moore used Tower 80 on December 17th or December 18th.
I can, sir. I just don't have that at my fingertips
Now,
right now to answer that.
Did you say that Tower 80 is closer to Peachtree Boat Landing than Tower 115?
I did not, sir,
You did
because
not.
I
I
don't.
asked, but you couldn't answer.
Yes, sir, without going and looking it up in the spreadsheet.
Could you tell us if Sidney's phone ever uses Tower 80 at all?
I could from the records. I don't have that memorized.
You were provided these records
Yes, sir.
pursuant to the search warrant, but you can't answer the question.
I did not memorize all several thousands of rows of records, so, sir. I'm sorry, no.
So if Mr. Moore's phone is using Tower 115, you can't say if Mr. Moore is at Peachtree Boat Landing or if Mr. Moore is at his residence.
No, sir. The records only document his use of that tower.
Excuse me.
Yes, sir.
Sir, I'm going to ask you to turn to page 76 of Exhibit 63, your PowerPoint presentation.
Yes, sir.
And the green sector that is displayed on that page, is that a PCMD transaction?
Yes, sir, it is.
And what time did that transaction occur?
3:16 p.m. I'm sorry, 3:16 a.m. on the 18th of December, 2013.
Okay. And now the green arc that's near the Moore residence, what does that represent?
That represents the measured distance Mr. Moore's phone was from that tower when that call was initiated.
Now that's an estimated distance, right?
Well, it's a measured distance based on signal timing, sir. It's the GPS coordinate that's in those same records that was estimated.
And we've already discussed that Sprint does not rely on this information.
But Sprint does not guarantee this information. I would say Sprint wouldn't collect it if they weren't relying on it for some valuable use.
Internal use only?
I don't know the extent of their use, sir. I know they provided it to us in this case.
Okay. Now, on page 76 of this exhibit, you've got a green dot here in a green area there. What does that dot represent?
So what we're looking at here, when I showed how we map the PCMD data, we show the location of the tower, we show the direction the antenna faces, we show the curved line. In this case, on this record, it's curving very close to Mr. Moore's residence. And then the estimated location where the engineers thought that the phone might be is the green dot he's referring to. That green dot is out in a green area on the map that is the wildlife refuge.
So according to your map, Mr. Moore's phone is in the Waccamaw National Wildlife Refuge?
No, sir, that would be an incorrect understanding of this map. As I said, that's an estimated location. And it is an accurate map as to where Sprint put that. It's not uncommon at all to see these estimated lat longs in the general area. When we looked at the grouping of all of these, for instance, for most of the day on the 17th, I showed you that those dots were splattering all around his residence. In fact, none of them actually were on the residence. So especially with those estimated locations, we tend to not trust those near as much as the distances. As I say, trust physics over geeks all the time. The physics, the distance is a measurement of physics, the timing. Those estimates are a guy like me, an engineer who had to come up with an algorithm to estimate. They did that because we're using these to try and find dead areas. So they wanted a best estimate of where the phone was. Sometimes they're off.
So your testimony is that the information is accurate, but that it is only an estimate.
I'm testifying that my maps are accurate as to the information that was in the record. So this is where the location was that the lat long for this record was given. As far as how to interpret this map properly, those are an estimate. And so to see it, at about the same distance as the distance arc, but to see this lat long perhaps, off to the side by as much as probably a half mile or more, that's something that we see.
So this could be off by up to a half a mile?
Which part, sir?
I'm sorry, I thought you just testified that it might be off by a half a mile.
Again, if we're talking specific to the estimated locations, we do see, as I showed on the map, that they will splatter around a location. The distance arcs are what I tend to trust much more than these estimates when we do the analysis. It's these distance arcs that have led me to find those missing persons in these records.
Okay, so who put the estimate on that exhibit? You.
I did, sir, yes.
Okay. And that estimate, you came up with that estimate?
No,
or
sir.
did Sprint come up with that
Sprint
estimate?
did, sir.
Sprint did. Okay. But then again, Sprint tells us that it's not that accurate.
Sprint says that they don't guarantee the accuracy.
Okay, and in this case, the estimate ended up with Mr. Moore's phone being in a National Wildlife Refuge.
Yes, sir.
And Sprint says they cannot guarantee the accuracy of that information.
That's correct.
Now, there's also a red sector displayed on that page, and that would be Miss Elvis's phone, right?
Yes, sir. That's correct.
And at that time, Miss Elvis's phone was using the tower and sector closest to her residence.
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell us if Sidney Moore's phone and Heather Elvis's phone were together at that time?
At this time, it's very improbable that they were together. I'm an engineer, so 100% are hard for me, but extremely unlikely. They were many, many miles apart. It's unlikely that they could find any place to be at the same spot and use towers that far apart at this time.
Now I'm going to ask you to turn your attention to page 77 of your PowerPoint presentation.
Yes, sir.
And this is another PCMD transaction that's indicated by the green dot on the map. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
That would be Sidney Moore's phone.
Yes, sir.
And again, that's based on an estimate,
Yes.
based on information that Sprint says is unreliable.
They don't say it's unreliable. They say won't guarantee it.
They issue a disclaimer for the information. And what time did that transaction occur?
317.
Okay. Now, if you go back to the picture on page 76, and then the picture on page 77, Sidney's phone moves from the National Wildlife Refuge closer to the Moore residence. Is that correct?
Well, the estimated location does. I actually would expect that Mr. Moore's phone did not move within 30 seconds any substantial amount. So his phone was in the same location. Sprint's estimate did change slightly.
You keep using that word estimate a lot, sir. Can you tell this jury that this information is accurate or not?
Yes, it is. The maps are accurate. I'm just using the terms that the carriers use. It's an estimated phone location. It's simple as that. If you understand that this data originally had its roots in them trying to find those dead spots, what they would do is they would find their drop calls, they would get these estimated locations, they would go out there with a van and measure the signal and find the dead zone and then adjust their network to fix it.
All right, the green arc on page 77, does that indicate the distance from the tower that Sidney's phone was from Tower 115?
Yes.
And how accurate is the distance from the tower measurement?
What we find in those distances, and again, this is from many, many times of actually using these records to go find the phone out there, we find that the vast majority of time, probably 80% of the time, they are within 100 meters plus or minus of that distance. That's why it's important when we look at these, we don't just take a single distance. So there were times where I pointed out a very strong banding of repeated distances showing the exact same thing. It's when we have multiple records that just consistently are saying the same thing, such as around the time of the phone booth, that we know those distances are more likely to have the phone within a few hundred meters. That's when we go out and find the missing people, is when we see that. If we only have one, it may be one of those ones like these dots that he's referring to, where it wasn't quite as accurate as where the phone actually was. So we don't look at any one of these records in isolation. That's why we look at the entire set of records and see the consistent story that they tell.
But again, when you say within, I think you said 10 meters?
Generally, we see, now the raw data is 1/100th of a mile, so the data itself, even if it were measured more accurately, the reports are only within about 250 meters plus or minus.
But that is also an estimate, correct?
What do you mean, sir?
When you say that the distance is accurate to within, I think you said 1/100th of a mile or 1/10th of a mile?
That's the data is, they'll give 1.45 miles. So we only have 2 digits after the decimal place. So that limits how accurate it could be. My experience has been that we often, but not always, find them within a couple hundred meters of those distance arcs, especially when we have repeating distances in a short period of time.
Okay, so again, it's an estimate.
The data is not an estimate. It's a measure of physics. As far as whether it's how accurate it is, well, we're probably splitting hairs here. Was it within 10 feet, 20 feet, 100 feet? We're talking within a few hundred meters here generally.
And then you said what you do is you take other bands of arcs, but those are also estimates. Would that be fair to say?
I don't really call those estimates. I call those measurements. We just have to understand the accuracy of the measurement.
They're measurements based on PCMD data. Yes.
Where they are PCMD data, yes, sir.
Okay, right. Per call measurement data. The same data that Sprint issued a disclaimer for.
Yes, sir.
So now, if Mr. Moore's phone was using a tower near Broadway at the beach, we would see a different tower being used. Is that correct?
From this one here. So you're
Yes.
saying that at this time, if he were down near Broadway at the beach, would he use this tower? No, he would not. He would use one of the ones over there.
And there would be different per call measurement data information.
Yes, sir.
And is the distance from the tower shown on page 76 and 77, is it closer to the Moore residence or to Peachtree Boat Landing?
Those distances are consistent with a phone that was probably perhaps at the residence. Again, we don't have the exact location, but these are consistent with the phone being at the residence.
Okay, so it's your testimony that those phones are probably or at the Moore residence?
These phones are consistent, these records are consistent with the phone being there at this time.
Okay. And that's even based on the PCMD data?
In this case, yes, on this particular chart, yes, sir.
All right, sir, let me turn your attention to page 78 of your PowerPoint.
Yes, sir.
Does that slide show even more PCMD records for Mr. Moore's phone?
Yes, sir, it does.
And do the green arcs still represent the distance from the phone to Tower 115?
Yes, sir.
Do the green arcs ever cross or get close to Peachtree Boat Landing?
No, sir, they do not.
Do any of those distance from tower arcs get near Peachtree Boat Landing on December 17th or December 18th?
No, sir.
And based on your analysis, Sidney's phone was using Tower 115 from 3:16 in the morning to 3:41 in the morning.
The 2 calls at 3:16:17, and again, the 4 calls between 3:38 and 3:41, yes, sir. That's the tower that was used.
Does his phone ever use the tower that is closest to Peachtree Boat Landing, Tower 80?
No, sir.
So at no point can you tell us Sidney's phone, Heather's phone in the same location?
During this particular time frame,
Yes.
no, sir.
And during that time frame, Mr. Moore is using the tower that he usually uses?
Well, I don't know about Mr. Moore. I know his phone is.
Yes, sir. Now, the per call measurement data, distance measurements of Sidney's phone from 316 to 341 cover his home residence, correct?
Yes, sir.
And at no point is there a latitude or longitude dot near Peachtree Boat Landing?
No, sir.
So based on this report, can you tell me if Sidney Moore ever went to Peachtree Boat Landing?
It does not support or preclude that. And certainly not him. We're only talking his phone here, of course.
Court's indulgence.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Melson, did you ever do any location analysis for any phones other than the 3 that you already have testified about?
I'm not sure I understand.
Okay. Did you review any records for Stephen Sherald?
Not that I'm aware of, sir.
Did you review any records for Jeremy Flynn?
Not that I'm aware of, sir.
Did you do a drive test on these towers?
I did come out here and we did drive around. It was related to some timestamp issues that I wanted to confirm. So yes, there was a point where I did bring a Sprint phone out here to determine the accuracy of the timestamps on some of these PCMD records.
Okay, so what you did, and I just need to be clear about it, you obtained a phone that was similar to the phone that Miss Elvis owned, yes?
I had my own phone at the time. I believe it might have been Mr. Moore's phone. It was a Sprint phone. I wasn't necessarily concerned about make and model of the phone.
Okay. Now, what kind of analysis did you do?
Well, what we saw on these PCMD records is that the timestamp was off by 1 hour. I've seen that in other areas of the country. It's something that Sprint has confirmed and documented that it can happen. Before I adjusted the timestamps on those records by that 1 hour, I wanted to be extra cautious in doing that because I don't like altering the data that we get without good reason. So the point of that was to come out and specifically check these records on the Sprint network. And we did in fact see that the time zones were off by an hour at times. And so that's why we adjusted the records 1 hour on those in these, yes.
So you didn't test the signal strength of the towers?
That wasn't something that I was concerned about, no.
Okay. Did you check the direction of the antennas on top of the towers?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Did you check the direction of the antennas on top of the towers?
No, sir.
Okay. And there are 3 of them up there, 1 for each sector.
Typically, yes.
So what you did was what again?
We wanted to make sure that adjusting the timestamps on the PCMD records by 1 hour was the correct thing to do. So I came out specific to understand the timestamps of records in the Sprint network.
So for the testing that you did on the network, the only result of the testing was that you adjusted the timestamp?
Yes, and that's a known issue with the Sprint network. I just wanted to make sure that it was something we were actually seeing here.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Melson. No further questions.
Thank you, sir.
Reader ready.
Yes, sir, Your Honor, just a few questions. Y'all hold me to 2.
You didn't say 2, you said 2.
Mr. Melson, the first question I wanted to ask you is, Mr. Galmore asked you about GPS coordinates, correct?
Yes,
And he was talking about how those are more accurate. Is that correct?
yes,
Okay. And tower data only gives us a general idea of where the phone is located.
yes,
Now, and he also asked you what we provided you with, correct?
yes,
So we could figure out what was going on.
correct.
Did we provide you with GPS records for the defendant?
Yes, actually, there were some GPS coordinates from a Google history report. It's not uncommon once I do analysis to ask for corroborating location information, again, to make sure that everything's consistent. So yes, one of the things I did look at was Google location history.
And what did the record show?
It supported this analysis.
And how about Sidney Moore's GPS record?
I was provided the returns for that, but there was no data.
Okay, and why wasn't there data?
The information from Google on that said that the data had been deleted and the account had been closed.
Okay, and did it tell you when the data had been deleted?
Yes, ma'am.
When was it deleted?
I believe it was December 25th, 2013, right around Christmas time that year.
Okay, but it was around sometime December 25th of 2013.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so Mr. Moore had Google coordinates on his phone, didn't he?
Google would likely have had them, yes.
And just like Mr. Galmore was asking you, when you're driving around, it's collecting information.
Yes,
But that information wasn't available to you or me.
that's correct.
That information had been deleted on December 25th.
Yes, ma'am.
So the only thing we were left to map out for the defendant was what you got, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And you would have mapped out the Google coordinates for the defendant if they had not been deleted,
I
correct?
certainly would have used them to verify my maps and the accuracy of my interpretation of the data.
So you mapped out the only thing that was available to us.
Objection, lady.
Yes, stay, rephrase your question.
Certainly, Your Honor. Did you map out the only data that was available to us to show where this defendant was?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So how about the victim? Did we have GPS coordinates for the victim?
Yes, we did.
Okay, so those had not been deleted.
Correct.
Tell this jury whether or not those coordinates confirmed and corroborated the data that you showed them earlier.
What we're talking about, our phones will run an Android operating system. We're familiar with that. Google is the company behind that. One of the services Google provides records our phone's location, and so that's the type of data that we're looking at. They record it a few different ways, including turning on our phone's GPS and recording them. So that's the data we're talking about. It's common for me to look at those sources of data to make sure that my analysis of these records are correct. And those GPS coordinates did in fact show that Heather was in these locations that we've been talking about.
Now, let me ask you this. Google accounts, like I had a Gmail account at one time, I deleted it. Can you call up Sprint and delete the phone records that we mapped out?
No.
Okay, okay. So Sprint isn't gonna let you delete those records,
No, ma'am.
but Google will allow you to delete your account.
Yes, ma'am.
And when it's deleted, you can't get no coordinates, emails, nothing then from Google.
Correct.
Okay. Now, Mr. Galmore asked you about routed calls,
Yes.
correct? Okay, and we asked you a lot about the location of the phone, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and we're trying to get some idea where that individual is. Now, just so the jury's clear, what you mapped out earlier included phone calls, correct? Did it include text messages?
Objection, Your Honor, leading.
She just asked, did it include text message overruled
Yes, sir.
that question?
For the Sprint phones in the case Mr. Moore's and Mrs. Moore's, yes, those do have text messages, but they do not provide location information. T-Mobile did not provide text messages, so Specific to text, we know who texted whom, but we do not know where the phones were from the Sprint records, and we have no information related to text if I'm on T-Mobile.
So for the Sprint phones, did it include phone calls?
Yes,
So when somebody was actively dialing out or picking up, it included the location?
yes.
And explain to this crowd what the data location is. Like, what is that?
In terms of voice, text, or data?
Yes.
So data usage, and we see some of that. Some of this PCMD data may have been data connections. That would be checking sports scores, emails, weather, any of that type of thing.
Okay, but the only time we know that the phone is being used by an individual is a phone call or a text message, correct?
Yes,
Okay. Now, Mr. Galmore asked you about routed calls. Do you remember that?
yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now, he was asking you, and correct me if I'm wrong, that routed calls were sometimes when they go to voicemail,
That is one use of a routing call.
okay? And if that's how the call is routed, would it indicate it on the phone records?
Yes,
Okay? And would you recognize it on these phone calls or these phone records if it was routed to voicemail?
yes,
Okay? And are these the records that you looked at to analyze?
Those been marked, that you showed. We need to have the record, know what he's looking at, so if you want to have it
I'm
marked,
sorry, let me mark this.
just for them.
This phone record. It's Exhibit 65. Thank you, Judge.
65 ID only.
yes, these are Mr. Moore's Sprint records.
Okay. Now, all these questions about routed calls and all this talk about the phone calls at 3, look here. 3, let's see. Let me get a time here. 3:38, 3:39, 3:40, 3:41.
Yes,
You remember Mr. Galmore asking you about those phone calls?
yes, ma'am.
Okay. When you look at the defendant's records, does it indicate whether or not those calls were routed?
Yes, I'm going to see if I can quickly get to them. I do believe all 4 of those calls ended up routing to voicemail.
Okay. So when he was asking you about 338, 339, 340, 341, using the tower closest to the defendant's home, do you remember that?
Yes,
But in reality, all those phone calls were going to voicemail.
yes, ma'am, they were.
Okay. So we don't have any evidence of whether the defendant was with his phone.
No, ma'am, we don't.
Okay, because we know he didn't pick it up, did he?
There's no indication that anyone touched the phone, so the phone certainly rang. It rang that 26 seconds each time, and then timed out and went to voicemail.
So all those last phone calls went to the defendant's voicemail.
Yes, ma'am.
He never picked up one of them.
No, ma'am.
So the phone was never picked up by the defendant on those last 4 phone calls.
Or by anyone else, no, ma'am.
Okay. Now, mark this real quick, Judge. I better get into one thing I wanted to get in earlier. I'm showing you now 66.
Statement 66.
Mr. Melson, can you look at this and tell me if this accurately marks earlier the map that we looked at and the phone calls, the last 4 phone calls, when they were and who they were to and from?
Yes, those are the timestamps of those phone calls.
Okay. Your Honor, this time, can I place it into evidence?
Any objection?
No, sir.
Without objection, state 66 is accepted.
Thank you, Judge. I'm going to publish it at a later time.
Okay.
Now, Mr. Melson, earlier, there were all these questions about the reliability of the phone records and the tower data. Do you remember that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. it was hard to get a read because it seemed like Mr. Galmore, when the defendant was home, was all right with the data. But when he's riding by the victim's house, then the data's no good. But let me ask you something. How long have you been using phone data from Sprint and T-Mobile in your job?
Well, before I started my company, I actually had been volunteering for quite a number of years, pro bono, just working missing persons cases, trying to help find these missing persons through these phone records. So I've been analyzing this type data for well over a decade.
Over a decade. And in your working experience, have you found the data to be reliable?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And have you actually, we called you in here because you've actually been able to locate missing persons using the phone data, hadn't you?
Yes, ma'am.
And that's how me and you met and got connected.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Originally, we were using the data to try to locate the victim.
That's correct. I originally worked on this case, as I do missing persons all over the country, pro bono, just trying to see if I could help locate Heather.
And you have actually guided several law enforcement agencies to missing persons. They were ultimately located.
Yes.
She is leading it, she's asked that question 3 times.
Thank you, Judge. I'll move on.
Thank you.
I want to look at this disclaimer, just to touch on it, that Mr. Galmore put in. Are you familiar with this?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now tell this jury, does it say that the data and all this information that Sprint puts out is inaccurate?
No, ma'am. It says that they don't guarantee it.
Okay. And Sprint probably is $1 million company, correct?
Suspect.
Okay, and they use this data partly to bill customers, like me and probably these people.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so it's probably not too inaccurate, if inaccurate at all.
No, ma'am.
How long has Sprint been around?
They've been around since the beginning in some form or fashion, at the beginning of cell phone technology.
Okay. Now, one more question. I know it's getting late and we need to tie it up. Mr. Galmore asked you earlier, can you put the 2 phones together? Do you remember that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And I can't remember, you tell me, was he asking specifically about the morning of the 18th, night of the 17th, morning of the 18th?
I don't remember specifically. I believe it was centered around those timeframes.
Okay. Let me ask you something on that very question. When Heather's phone is moving around, do you remember that time frame from around 1, maybe 2:30
Yes.
to 3 a.m.?
Yes.
Okay, we see her phone moving around.
Yes.
Tell this jury where the defendant's phone is at that time.
We have no data, no records related to the defendant's phone during that time, so we don't know where his phone may have been.
But we had records from at least 9 p.m. right up to the time of the payphone call.
That's correct.
And then all of a sudden, dead silence
That's correct.
while she's moving around.
That's correct.
Okay, so we don't know where his phone is.
No, ma'am, we don't.
They could be together, we just don't know.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, the next time we see her phone is at 3:17, correct?
After she moved and came back, yes, at 3:17.
Okay, who does she call?
Mr. Moore's phone, the 75 phone number.
Okay, and then all of a sudden the phone is back showing up on the towers, correct?
Yes.
And what area is it hitting off of at that time?
The records are consistent with the general area of his residence.
I'm going to show you what's been put in evidence. States 32. Let me see. I'm looking at this one. Well, yeah. Maps. Not a lot of women's strong point. Let me ask you something. Could you hold this for me? And that way I won't be in their way leaning over. Thank you. Now, Mr. Moore's residence is here,
Okay.
okay? And this is the area you're telling me he's at 317,
Yes.
okay? Hold on, hold on. That small map wasn't enough, Judge. I'm going quick. See, evidence. 56. I promise you, we're wrapping it up.
You know what, right now, 20, that one question is 20.
Okay, my shirt again. All right, Heather's phone is around her residence at 3:17 a.m., correct?
Yes.
Way over here, correct? What? Over Myrtle Beach area. When she calls, he's in the area of his house, correct? They talk for 4 minutes. Does her phone move after that phone call?
It must in order to use this tower over here. But during the phone call, no. After the phone call, it had to have.
Okay, so after the phone call, it then moves to this area.
Yes.
And would that tower be consistent with the phone being at Peachtree Landing?
The tower that was used over here on the other side of the river, yes, I do think that's consistent with the phone being at Peachtree.
Okay, and when you looked at the GPS coordinates, did that corroborate the phone being in the area of Peachtree Landing?
The Google data actually puts the phone exactly at the landing.
Okay, it actually puts it at Peachtree Landing.
Correct.
So she moves from over here to right up the road from where his phone is.
Correct.
Now, when she gets here, she starts making phone calls again, correct?
Yes.
Who's she calling?
Mr. Moore's phone again.
Okay. And does he ever pick up?
No, ma'am.
Okay. No further questions, Judge? With a minute to spare.
You said, give me a minute. Galmore, any questions?
Very, very quick.
You certainly are free to ask as many as you want. You can have the one question she had that equals 30.
Thank you, sir. So it is your testimony that the presentation that you made to the jury today is accurate?
Yes.
Okay. And your presentation indicated that Mr. Moore's phone was at his residence at 3:41 in the morning.
I did not testify that it was at his residence.
Okay.
Simply that it was in that general area and the distances are consistent, and that his phone was not answered during those last 4 calls.
All right. Now, if the phone was not answered during those last 4 calls, those would be the routing calls? Those last 4?
Those last 4 calls did go to voicemail.
Okay. Would that be consistent with someone calling and then Mr. Moore simply not answering the phone, just maybe laying it down
Yes, sir.
and not going back to it?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Melson. No further questions.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Mr. Nelson, you're free to step down, sir, and I assume you want this witness to be excused.
Absolutely, Your Honor.
Any objections?
No, sir.
And you are free to leave.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Tripp.
And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your endurance and thank you for, in these things, some people may get the wrong impression because this is serious business and we all understand. And we all adults. But it's nice to have a little bit of levity sometimes to break the tension. And I appreciate your permitting that and appreciate the parties and both sides in this. It's just not putting any emphasis on one thing. But and I thank you for you've been extremely diligent today, and I just appreciate that. I come out my office and I see y'all already ready to go. I said, well, my 10 minutes is going to be cut to 8. That's okay. I appreciate that. You still, of course, cannot discuss this case with anyone, and you can't allow anybody to talk with you about it and watch any programs and do any independent research, and I know that each of you will honor that, and I'll ask you again tomorrow, did you do that for me? And I hope you have a restful evening, and if you will be back in your jury room at 9:30, we'll resume the trial at that time. Have a great evening. Thank you. Absolutely. That's wonderful. Watch.
I know, Joe. You ain't got to tell me.
Are there anything from the state before we recess?
No, sir.
Anything from the defendants?
No, sir.
Thank you, Ms. Gilmore. Mr. Helms, if you can keep her for a few minutes, because until the court reporter says you're free to go, you must remain in the courtroom.
Yes, sir,
Both sides.
you got it.
Understood, Your Honor.